Hey guys, so I'm your group facilitator this week for On the Road, and I just got done reading your reflections, and they were really awesome to read because it helped me kind of see things from different points of view, and also see like similarities we all talked about, as well as see things that I didn't notice in the book. So to start, Danielle kind of talked about how Jack was a follower and he didn't do his own thing. He just followed Neil around wherever he went. Specifically, she talks about the moment where Jack sets off to discover himself at the end, and how he needed to do that as in order to figure out who he was, which was something I also talked about. So it's interesting that you agreed with that one. Jess talked about relevance and timeliness, which was very interesting. She brought up an awesome point and said that the readers get to see the gap between the older people of the Depression and the newer wild generation, and how the two generations fit together in one world. So that was really cool. And she also mentioned that she talked to her dad and grandpa about the book, which is cool. I'm sure that was cool to hear about how they saw things from a different perspective compared to like a different generation. And then she also talked about picking up multiple women and honesty. For example, they talked about sex, and how they just thought they made it into not a big deal, and talked about it was just an innocent act, but they didn't actually care for the women. Megan talks about how Neil is an unwanted angel, which is that was a funny analogy when you said that he was like a mosquito or something, a tick on your arm, because I kind of felt that way too. He'd come into town and he'd persuade Jack to travel with him again, and Jack fell for it every time until the very end. He finally did his own thing. Megan also talked about friendship being one-sided, and how Neil was kind of a role model to Jack, and he just followed him. And then you also talked about how Jack and Dean just drank together, and got women together, whereas Neil and Carlos would stay up through like all night talking and being like real friends and listening to one another. So that was a really interesting point that I didn't think to compare. So in general, we kind of all talked about how Neil left Jack for women all the time, but Jack continued to follow him, and we also touched on how he finally set out at the end to do his own thing and figure out who he was as an individual. And also we talked about how the friendship was completely one-sided, and we didn't really understand why. So that was interesting. For mine, I tended to focus on how women didn't really play a role in the book. They were the constant reason as to why the men were going from coast to coast, but but Jack describes them as objects and just doesn't really give them a fair name, I guess. He uses them, and I thought that was interesting that their full goal in traveling was to find a woman, but then they would just treat them like objects, and he describes them very awfully, like he just kind of treats them crappy. So I thought that was really interesting that their full goal was women, but they treated them poorly. So my questions, I have two questions for you guys. The first question is, do you think that there was something that happened to Neil and Jack in their childhood or in their past that made them kind of into these men that are thrill-seeking and reckless, for example, using women? Why do you think that they thought that this was okay? What was the driving factor to force them to do this? And then my second question is, this book is the story of traveling, and these men are in search of true love and happiness. So do you think perhaps if they stayed in one place and really tried to make long-lasting friendships and relationships, do you think that they would have been like more successful and like able to achieve happiness versus constantly picking up and moving and unable to really find their ideal true happiness in a woman? So those are my questions. Kind of explain if you agree or not, or what you kind of think. So thanks.